Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Just to kind of introduce myself a little bit more, I'm a products liability lawyer, and I represent people that have been injured by defective drugs and medical devices. And my introduction to hernia mesh litigation, which I'm very involved in at the moment, started with someone referred me a case of someone who suffered a bad outcome from a particular product. And investigation of that product and my conclusion that it maybe merited further investigation and litigation led us to do a little bit of the advertising that was mentioned earlier. And what came out of that was an overwhelming response from individuals that have suffered some of these mesh complications that you know about across the spectrum of different products. And so that's kind of an introduction to who I am and what I do. As you may have correctly inferred, I'm not a medical doctor, and so what I won't be doing today is recommending for or against any particular treatment modalities, but what I will do is just give some perspective from the things that I experience and face every day in my practice that could act as food for thought as you, as practitioners, make that decision whether or not to deploy mesh prophylactically and inform your choices on selection of biomaterials. So these are my disclosures. They're a little bit different from everybody else's. I'm on the Plaintiffs' Executive Committee for the Atrium C-Cure MDL in New Hampshire. I'm involved in the barred polypropylene mesh MDL in Southern District of Ohio, and also the physio mesh MCL in New Jersey. And as a result of the large response from potential clients, I'm actively always investigating, always learning about different products and what their risk profiles are. These disclosures, they do influence what I'm going to talk about. They do influence my views on these things for a couple of reasons. In the process of prosecuting these cases and participating in these litigations, I've been appointed by these judges throughout the country to represent clients nationwide who have these sorts of complications. The things that I get access to that you don't are, I get to see the design history files of these products. I get to see the complaint files that oftentimes don't make it to the FDA and don't make it to you. I get to see the internal complaints that you as doctors are giving to these companies, as well as their internal, sometimes lascivious emails about how to sell you guys more mesh. And so that absolutely does influence how I view this topic and my general worldview on how someone should make these sorts of decisions. So the research as it is, it focuses, as it should, on does mesh prophylaxis reduce the incidence of incisional hernia, and that should be the primary endpoint because that's the point. From my perspective, what I see day in, day out are the complications from those mesh products. And so my natural response is, what about the complications? It's a list of, it's certainly not an exhaustive list of the mesh complications that we see, but this is the buckets, so to speak, that the cases that I represent fall into, and the ones that are most common and the ones that end up retaining me to represent them. So the goals that I have here is just to take account of some of the information that you might take into consideration in deciding whether or not to perform prophylactic mesh placement, and if you do, what sort of biomaterial should you select. Discuss a little bit about the regulatory framework, how those products got to the mesh cart, and whether you should take that into consideration in making your selections. And for time, I'll probably skip a portion and talk a little bit forward looking at some ideas on how a practitioner can gather more information in terms of making an informed risk-benefit analysis. So the data is pretty good, as Dr. Hope pointed out, on the effectiveness of preventing hernia with mesh prophylaxis. But do we really know much about the incidence and the magnitude of the risks. So what we have are these relatively small but growing list of studies. We have FDA data you can get on the MAUD database, and if you have a question about the incidence of complications of a particular prosthetic, you can research that and see what doctors are reporting around the country. And then probably the most important thing that you might consider is just your own subjective experience. If you've been using a product prophylactically or otherwise, and you seem to have a good track record, that's, I think, justifiably what you would rely on largely in your practice in making those sorts of decisions. So I want to take these in turn and identify some of the limitations and just stimulate some conversation and some thinking about how that analysis is best done. So the available studies generally, not so much with the peristomal repairs, but with the prophylactic placement with non-peristomal laparotomies. The studies themselves are a little bit heterogeneous in a number of ways. The secondary endpoints that are followed are not always consistent. There's a lot of focus on seroma and chronic pain, but if you would go back to that list of complications that I see on a daily basis, there's not a lot of attention paid to all those different manifestations of mesh complications throughout these studies. And so there are a lot of complications that they're not being captured by the studies that exist. There's heterogeneity, and I think this is one of the more important things. There's heterogeneity in the biomaterial that's studied. And there are some good studies with supportive data, but if these studies are about UltraPro, how is that going to help you make an informed choice about what to do if your hospital doesn't stock UltraPro? And so there needs to be more thoroughgoing research on individual biomaterials. How do they perform, so that you can have a more robust idea of what risks you're actually exposing your patient to. And also, one of the limitations, it varies from study to study in terms of how long the window you're looking at those patients and how long you're following up. There were several with a 6-month follow-up period. But again, from my perspective, what I see on average, if you exclude the chronic pain cases, the time from implantation of mesh to manifestation of injury on average is about 2.5 years for my particular client base. So the second of the sources that you can go to educate yourself about the incidence of these risks is the MAUD database. And more recently, we're finding out about these very drastic limitations. So it's been well documented that medical device failures are woefully underreported. And recently, the FDA flagged a systematic problem, and they surveyed 17 hospitals and found a systematic and really severe underreporting issue. Last month, we also learned about the fact that there's a large database of complaints and adverse event reports that are hidden from you. The FDA has them. The companies have generated those and communicated those to the FDA, but you don't have access to those. So if you have a particular prosthetic that you're thinking about using prophylactically or otherwise, and you go to the MAUD database to try to assess for yourself the risk profile, you don't have access to a lot of that. And lastly, but something that we see every litigation is that manufacturers do change the structured data that they use to report to the MAUD database. You will see over time that there will be adverse event reports on a particular product, but then as those reports accumulate, the structured data submissions will change so that it's more generic. Instead of saying, I don't know if I should say products, but instead of naming the product, allowing you to draw the conclusion, it'll just say mesh polymeric, so that you can't see necessarily that the product that you're contemplating using might have a higher risk profile than you think. And so lastly, of the information sources that we have, your own subjective experiences. So you've had a good track record with a product, you believe in it, you've had good results. In regard to what I see in my practice, and I have a large number of clients, active hernia mesh clients of mine that have one of these cognizable injuries, 3,000 in my office alone, and we've vetted many, many more. By and large, those individuals that have had an explantation procedure, they don't go back to the original facility. For right or wrong, they just don't. It's actually very uncommon for what we call the implanter and the explanter to be the same provider or the same hospital. And so your subjective experience, it's important, but there are gaps, and there are patients that you're not capturing in your own observations that are suffering from some of these complications. And so that's just sort of an overview of, when we're thinking about informed risk-benefit analysis, these are the limitations of the information that you have access to that I think you need to keep in mind when making your decisions. I want to talk a little bit about, and I've been doing a lot of implanter depositions just as a part of the atrium C-cure litigation recently. And the subject, one of the main subjects of those depositions is how does that surgeon make decisions? What factors do you consider? What research do you read? If you had known all the bad things that I just showed you, would you have still chosen to use this mesh? That's the thrust of those depositions. And I've learned about the mesh cart that a lot of doctors, they choose from just what's in stock at the hospital. They pull it off the shelf, and there's not a lot of ability, a lot of opportunity for you to pick and choose among them. So rest assured that everything that's on the mesh cart, everything that's on the shelf in the hospital, those are Class 2 devices which did not undergo pre-market approval through the FDA. Instead, they went through a process called 510K. What's the difference between those two things? Well, pre-market approval, and some of you may know all this stuff, pre-market approval requires clinical data prior to launch of the product. You have to have human studies, and you have to undergo a much more rigorous analysis of the safety and efficacy of your product before it hits the shelves. 510K, completely different. It's not even a scientific-based process. It's a bureaucratic process. All you have to do to get your brand new mesh with new bells and whistles and biomaterials in it is you have to prove that you have to allege and support that it's substantially equivalent to either a device that was on the market pre-1976 or substantially equivalent to another mesh that went through the 510K process. And so what you have is sort of what we call 510K creep. Products get cleared, not approved, but cleared through the 510K process, and you can use that as a basis for your next product. And so that you get sort of a morph over time of these designs that were originally supposed to be based off of these pre-1976 products. It's easy to see from the economics of it why these companies are choosing to go the 510K route, and those are the products that are available. The New England Journal of Medicine did a pretty compelling analysis of the 510K process from a physician perspective in the wake of the DePuy ASR recall, and boiled down, that process doesn't consider safety and efficacy. It's only substantial equivalence. In fact, it's a loophole that these companies use to get their product to market without demonstrating safety and efficacy. And the 510K process is something that it's subject of a lot of litigation because juries, for example, they think if a product is on the market, then it must have been approved by the FDA. That's not necessarily true. It's only been cleared. And so there have been many trials to explain to juries that those are different processes. And even though this thing is on the market, it hasn't been evaluated for safety or efficacy prior to market launch at all. And here's some more how this is played out through the courts. To kind of end, I want to talk a little bit just about going forward, what do you do? And I don't think the question is, do you use mesh or do you not use mesh? I think that's not a precise enough question. I think what you need is more data in order to choose a particular, if you're going to place a prophylactic mesh, you need more data on particular prosthetics, the ones that are available to you, to be able to make an informed decision of what that risk profile and is the benefit of preventing that hernia worth the risk profile of that particular prosthetic. So one good idea that I was apprised of recently, Dr. Blatnick in St. Louis, proposed sort of an updated paradigm for labeling of mesh, where you can pick up a mesh product and it'll be like a food product that you see in a store. You see exactly the biomaterials that are in it, what the ball burst strength is. Is it partially resorbable or fully resorbable? Does it have polyglycolic acid or fish oil? Things like that, so that you can see at a glance what this thing is and make those informed decisions. Maybe if you are close to the bowel with a product, maybe you don't want something that's highly acidic or has a high inflammatory profile. So this is one of those things that I think that people should be thinking about. You should support and talk to Dr. Blatnick about this idea, and just move towards advocating for yourselves to have as much information at your disposal as you can to make productive and safe decisions for your patients. And that's it.